somebody started an argument online recently. I got an email about it, about if Drogon could beat Smaug. Basically, no. Drogon is a very young dragon and still, barely large enough to get Dany into the sky. Thank you, Laura. Thank you all, and thank you for that kind introduction, Laura.
So let's start talking about this new book, The World of Ice and Fire. I've been telling people who ask me about it that it's sort of the Silmarillion of your imaginary world. And you wrote it with a couple of co-authors, so I'd love to hear you talk about whether it is the Silmarillion of the known world, and about what it was like to work with Elio and Linda.
Well, this is a book that really began with my readers and my fans. Of course, in any epic fantasy, the world is a character. Setting is very important. And that, I think, has certainly been true since J.R. Tolkien and Lord of the Rings. Of course, fantasy goes back to ancient times, the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Ballad of Gilgamesh. But Tolkien really invented modern epic fantasy in its current form. And one of the things he did that was extraordinary was create Middle-earth in such detail. If you look at some of the pre-Tolkien fantasy, it's written more in the story of fairy tales, Once upon a time, there was a king, and the king had a beautiful daughter, and there was an evil vizier, and they may have names, but you won't know, like, who was the king's father, or who was his grandfather, or how the dynasty came to power, or how long it's ruled, or what the neighboring countries are. It's all told in this fairy tale thing. Tolkien gave us all these histories, all these appendices and genealogies, and everything was rooted, and it seemed as real as England or France or Germany when you read these things. And since then, that's become the style for epic fantasy. It's something that fantasy readers now expect. They expect a fully realized secondary world, as Tolkien called it. And so certainly that's what I set out to create in Westeros. Now, some of this is a magician's trick. It really wasn't with Tolkien. You have to consider that Tolkien was a very, very unusual writer. I mean, he was a linguist and a philosopher, and he spoke Old Norse and Old English. He was fascinated by myth. The story was almost secondary to Tolkien. He spent years creating his Silmarillion, never published it in his lifetime. And Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit were like stories set in the world he created, but for him, the world creation and the creation of languages was almost primary. If you look at it like an iceberg, they say the 3/4 of an iceberg is hidden below the surface. That was certainly true with Tolkien. With a lot of the fantasists who have followed Tolkien, though, it's a magician's trick. We have some ice on a raft, and we want you to think that there's this huge edifice underneath, just like with Tolkien, but there really isn't in some cases. And that was probably true with me in the beginning. I mean, I began with the story and the characters and the scene, and everything grew from that. But the world grew along with the story, and I rapidly discovered, as I got into the writing, that the readers wanted to know more and more about this world. And they would send me emails and letters saying, this Dance with the Dragons that you mentioned, can you tell me more about that? It sounds fascinating. Aegon's conquest, how did Aegon conquer the 7 kingdoms when, he only had a little army? You mentioned that, but I don't understand how it worked. Could you write me about that, or could you write a book about that? And, you know, as the years passed, a lot of these letters came in. And some of the earliest ones came in from Elio and Linda. Elio Garcia Jr. And Linda Ann Thompson. Elio is an American who lives in Sweden with his Swedish girlfriend, Linda, and they were among the earliest fans to get in touch with me way back in the middle '90s, and they wanted to run a game, and they had a million questions, and they displayed right away an almost obsessive knowledge of my world. In fact, I had to alter my world because of that obsessive knowledge. When, you know, in one of the earliest appendices that I created was, well, who are the kings who came before King Robert, who was king? We know that King Robert had usurped his throne from the Mad King, and before that there had been Aegon the Conqueror and the Targaryen conquest. Well, who are all the kings in between? So I invented a bunch of kings' names and dates, and I put that in the back of the first edition of Game of Thrones. And I had, you know, well, this is the first son of the second son, you know, this is the younger brother of. And everything was fine there until I wrote the Dunk and Egg story. The first Dunk and Egg story, The Hedge Knight, which was set 100 years before the main Ice and Fire story.
This is a set of, just in case anybody is not familiar with these, is 3 short stories.
3 novellas so far,
okay.
but there will be more. Yeah, and it's set 90 years before the events of A Song of Ice and Fire, and I had some Targaryens in that, and Elio and Linda looked at the date that was set in and compared it to the date, and they looked at, oh, this guy, you say in The Hedge Knight that this guy is like 35 years old, but that, you know, if you compare it to the dates given in the chronology that you had in book 1, he can't possibly be older than 7. Because of how old were these people when they had the children and all that. And I went through all these dates, and damned if he wasn't right. So I had to change the list of Targaryen kings, and someone who had previously been a son now became a younger brother. So all the dates would work. But that impressed me right there that Elio and Linda really knew this stuff. So fast forward, as the years go by, I got more and more requests for something like this, a concordance or a world book. A number of other fantasy authors had done these, you know, the so-and-so companion or the concordance or whatever. I said, okay, we'll do one too, and I'll have Elio and Linda come in, and they can do all the hard work. Because they keep track of the stuff better than I am. And we signed a contract back in 2008, I think it was. It was supposed to be delivered in, you know, a couple years. We know how that works. And like many of my projects, it got, not only did it become late, but it got much bigger than it initially had begun. And I wound up creating a lot more material. You know, the initial approach was Elio and Linda were going to go through the whole book, and they were going to, all of the published books and even some of the unpublished manuscripts at that point, and they were going to organize all the historical references and, you know, kind of beat out an outline and a rough draft, which they would then send to me, and I would polish that and revise that and fill it out, and I would fill in the gaps, because inevitably there would be big gaps where I didn't say anything. And we were going to have a history and a who's who. And we started working on that. Elio and Linda really started working on the who's who. And the who's who got so gigantically big with like thousands of characters that we said, we have like 500,000 words of who's who. So we took that out and we put that on the app. So that's the World of Ice and Fire app, and you can find all the who's who's here. Everybody who's ever walked on stage and said, you know, ouch, I'm wounded, will be mentioned there in the who's who. And then we concentrated on this, which is a book of history and legends, and I also wanted it to be beautiful. I'd looked at some of these other books that had been done. And some of them were pretty nice looking, but others were not. In fact, I won't mention names, but there's one prominent fantasy writer whose own fans call his concordance the big book of bad art. So I was determined that my book not have bad art. I wanted great art, lots of art on every page, a coffee table book heavily illustrated by some of the top fantasy illustrators in the world, and that's what we set out to get, and that's what we got. People like Magali Villeneuve and Ted Naismith and Mark Simonetti, Michael Comarch. We used a lot of art from Fantasy Flight Games, which has generated some wonderful art for the Game of Thrones card game and board game. And it is always finding some great artists from around the world for us. So, you know, all of that was very exciting. As usual, it grew bigger than anticipated. Our initial budget was that we were supposed to provide them with 50,000 words of text. And the rest would all be art, you know, and it would be a nice book. Elio and Linda, by the time they finished their portion of the thing, provided me with 70,000 words of text, just working on the stuff in there. And then I was supposed to add some sidebars, filling in gaps. And, you know, I did with things I knew about history that I'd already made up the stories and the characters, and I knew kind of how they worked, but I hadn't found a place to put them in the novels. So I said, I'll put them in here as sidebars. So I wrote like 300,000 words of sidebars. So at that point, my editor's head exploded. Anne is somewhere in the audience. You'll recognize her by her exploded head. And it was pointed out that we couldn't actually publish this book. You know, I wanted art on every page, and we had all this art that we bought and paid for, but if we put in all these words, then the art would be like a picture every 10 pages. So we had to sort of get back to at least closer to the original concept. So we wound up actually abridging many of my sidebars, and so what you're saying. So Elio and Linda worked on that, and Anne worked on that, and we got basically the outline of the histories and stuff in there, but not the fully detailed versions that I wrote. So when you say, "Is this your Silmarillion?" the answer is, well, kind of, but no, because I'm going to take all those sidebars and, you know, write more sidebars, and somewhere down the line, the full versions of all this stuff will be published, and we've been calling that the Grimmarillion. That's mostly about the Targaryen kings and the whole history of Westeros. That's really the focus of that book, will be focused on the Targaryens. This book has a shorter version of that in, but it also has the regional histories of each of the regions of Westeros and the noble houses, and it has a lot of material about the 9 free cities and the civilizations of Essos and the Summer Islands, and even some stuff about the Basilic Islands and the further east and the furthest east, and et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of great stuff. I hope you guys enjoy it. It was a lot of fun to write, I'll tell you that much.
It's the kind of book where if you love books that have maps in them, but you're obsessed with things that are on the edges of the maps, you'll get a lot of satisfaction from this. But also in-depth history of some of the situations that, you know, if you've read the book and you're watching the show and you're like, wait, where is the arbor again? You know, if you're one of those readers, this is really great. But you're sometimes like that. I mean, don't you sometimes use Elio as your kind of reference work for your own?
Yes, I do. He really does have a frighteningly exhaustive knowledge of my world and my characters. So you know, when I write a new chapter, it saves me time rather than going back and checking all the details. I just send it to Elio and say, "Did I contradict anything I said in a previous book in this one?" And he writes, "Yes, you did. This character, you know, you killed 3 books." Oh, okay. Graham, thanks for reminding me of that.
I've read some interviews with you where someone asks you a question, you go, I don't remember. Where's Elio when I Okay, so we have some of the images, and let's see. Okay, I'm going to ask you some questions related to the images. This is Aegon the Conqueror upon Balerion the Black Dread, and the artist is Jordi Gonzalez Escamilla. Is that correct? If I get the pronunciation wrong, you're going to have to correct me.
Well, I can't really read the signature, but if you say so, okay.
All right. So,
but it's pretty cool. It's one of my favorite pieces
Yeah.
in the book, and it captures, I think, the size of Balerion pretty accurately.
Good.
Somebody started an argument online recently. I got an email about it, about if Drogon could beat Smaug. And, as competitive as I am, and I would like my guys to win, basically, no, Drogon is a very young dragon and still, barely large enough to get Dany into the sky. Pretty formidable, and Smaug is gigantic. Not to mention the fact that Smaug, talks, and would probably have an intellectual advantage there. But Balerion could give Smaug some trouble. They're more equivalent in the size and ferocity department. On the other hand, Smaug would still have that talking thing going, but I don't know how much a difference that makes.
That's a question I hadn't thought to ask. So talk a little bit about the Targaryens. They're relative newcomers to Westeros.
Yes, the Targaryens are of Valyrian descent, and the freehold of Valyria was the superpower of my world for hundreds of years. There were sorcerer lords there who controlled certain dark magics, blood magic, and fire magic, pyromancy, and one of the things they had was dragons, and there were great dragon lord families that bred and controlled dragons and flew them into battle, and they competed for primacy within a structure not dissimilar to the Roman Republic, where a certain number of great families controlled everything, and most of the rest of the known world could not stand against the Valyrians. Even when they had larger armies, the Valyrian advantage of dragons was too great to overcome. But 400 years ago, the Doom came, the Doom of Valyria, and the entire freehold of Valyria was wiped out overnight. And the dragon lords and hundreds of dragons with it. The Targaryens had been one of the families, one of the oligarchy, but they had a premonition that something like this had come, and they had resettled to the Dragonstone Island off the coast of Westeros sometime before the Doom came to Valyria, and thereby avoided that, and it left them after a relatively short period with the only effective dragons in the world, and Aegon and his sisters used 3 of those dragons to conquer the 7 kingdoms of Westeros.
The Doom of Valyria is not. It's not really clear from the book exactly what causes it. It sounds like it's a bunch of volcanic explosions or something like that. But that's part of the sort of conceit of the book, is that it's written by a Westerosi scholar of some kind, and he's
right.
He's working with these imperfect sources.
There are actually, we took the conceit that this book was written by a couple maesters from the Citadel, Maester Yandel, who was the creation of Elio and Linda. And, Maester Yandel's material is drawn from preceding sources from primary sources that existed at the time, court records and memoirs that people put down, letters, just as today's historians or historians of other ages worked from sources that came before them. One of the sources that Maester Yenda works on is Archmaester Gildane, who has a far more detailed history of Westeros, only fragments of which have survived, the other portions have been lost. And Gildane is essentially my guy, so you know, when I give a big chunk of Gildane stuff, that's the unabridged stuff that I wrote. When it's Yandel, it's usually Elio and Linda cutting down on Gildane's material that I wrote. So Gildane will get his day in the sun when we publish the Grimmarillion, and all of his notes will finally be uncovered. And we also use other things. I mean, it was fun for us to play with this whole idea of history and sources and historiography and so forth. Because the truth is, like in real history, sometimes there are different accounts of what actually happened. I always love the line from The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, you know, when truth and legend disagree, print a legend. And I think that's true, you know. You look at, I've often said in interviews that the Red Wedding, my Red Wedding, was based at least in part on the Black Dinner of Scotland. The Black Dinner of Scotland was one of the inspirations for Red Wedding, and it's a tremendously colorful event. But if you read about it, there's this great legend about how it happened. And then there's some boring accounts by modern historians who say, no, it didn't really happen like that. Those are all later things that people made up to make it more dramatic. And, you know, I hate those later historians. They always want to ruin everybody's fun. But I wanted to reflect some of that in this. So even Gildane, who's not a primary source himself, is constantly going back to the actual primary sources, the court records kept by the maesters and some observations of the septons at the time. And in one case, one that I had particularly fun with, the testimony of Mushroom, who was the court fool during the Dance with the Dragons, and he was a dwarf with a large oversized head, and everybody thought he was feeble-minded. So, you know, they said all sorts of things in front of him because he's just an idiot, and what the hell is he going to understand? And of course, he understood everything, and he wrote it down, and he, not only that, his version is the absolutely most scurrilous version of it, because he's always putting the worst possible motives on everybody and adding a lot of sexual shenanigans and so forth that may or may not have happened. He's sort of the Suetonius of Westeros, if those of you who know Roman history and know Suetonius's work.
Okay, so now here we have the, I believe it's the Battle of the Trident. It's Robert Baratheon, who is the king who at the beginning of Game of Thrones, and he's fighting Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, who is Daenerys' brother, and he's also the heir to the throne of the Mad King Aerys, who was shortly after this killed by Jaime Lannister. I got that right?
That's right.
Okay.
This is one of the key scenes in A Song of Ice and Fire that occurs, you know, before the books open. But it sets the stage and everything that follows. Let's see, this is Justin Sweet, right? The painting?
Yes.
Yes, Justin. Incredible artist, Justin Sweet. He's done some magnificent work for us. We've had several great artists do the Battle of the Trident scene. What I like about Justin's version particularly is that he actually included the horses, because the two of them did fight on horseback, but most of the other artists who have illustrated the scene for one reason or another have omitted the horses and have just shown the two men on foot. In that sense, they're quite a lot like the TV show, which omits the horses at many opportunities. So where the TV show is short on horses. But we have horses here, and that's good. So the two of them were fighting in the middle of the Trident, the ford of the Trident, and It was the whole turning point where everything that occurs in the books was set up by this fight between two men.
It's great to see them at this point looking, you know, in the prime of their lives and so heroic, because by the time we jump into the narrative of Game of Thrones, Robert is kind of over the hill. This makes you see why he was, you know, why people thought so highly of him to begin with.
Yeah, Robert was like me when I began this. My hair was dark, I was skinnier, it was, you know, I was different in 91. Hey.
You know, it's also, you know, Rhaegar has kidnapped Robert's betrothed and Ned's sister, but it's really the culmination of a lot of forces. I mean, this is a big personal confrontation, but it's also kind of a big, you know, kind of socio-political confrontation. The Targaryens, King Aerys was crazy, and their sort of line seemed to be kind of decaying.
Well, one of the factors here is, of course, that 300 years ago in Aegon's conquest, the Targaryens conquered the Seven Kingdoms with dragons. But then, during the later civil war called the Dance with the Dragons, the majority of those dragons were killed. And the few that survived that war died a relatively short time later, or else left the known lands of Westeros. So by that point, the Targaryens were firmly established as the kings and had, you know, the power of tradition and legitimacy behind them. Generations had come up of age with the idea of the Targaryens were the king, and that the rules didn't apply to them. I mean, that was also part of it. You know, Targaryens were interlopers from another culture, and they had some unique factors that didn't necessarily fit into the mainstream of the other Westerosi lords, such as their traditional incest, you know, which was part of keeping the bloodlines pure so that they could better control the dragons, brother marrying sister, and you know, nephews and aunts and so forth, and all of that is detailed in the book, all of the matches and so forth. But by the time this comes around, the Targaryens have not had dragons for a long time, and I guess Robert and some of the other lords are starting to say, you know, we don't really have to be that afraid of these guys anymore. They can no longer, you know, just fly overhead and burn down our castles or entire cities. And it's beginning to this is beginning to dawn into it that maybe the Targaryens are just people like other people, and not an outside alien force with strange, scaly superpowers. Of course, then Dany, well, you know. So that's what the books are all about.
The ability to tame or control the dragons to a certain extent is inherited. It's a sort of one of the more mysterious elements of the ongoing storyline.
Well, it's something that's not quite entirely understood, and there is, I think, some interesting material in the World of Ice and Fire, and even more so in the later Grimmarillion that will elucidate various attempts to tame dragons. It's not a, you know, it's not a simple process. It's a dangerous process. You know, it's like my friend Melinda Snodgrass, who you met on one of your trips to New Mexico, raises and breeds and trains horses, Arabian horses and dressage horses, warm bloods, and so forth, and rides them in competition. And when I was starting this long ago in the 90s, I talked to her about some of the, you know, techniques for breaking a horse. You know, we all know the Bronco Buster kind of thing that we see in Western movies, but of course that's just for one particular kind of horse, and what Melinda does with her Arabians and her dressage horses is quite different, but there is a process there, a process of mastery, and of course you also go stuff with the dog whisperer and, you know, Jackson Galaxy and his cat from hell. There are ways to try to make animals do what you want, but it's not an exact science. And the thing about horses and dogs and cats and trying to modify their behavior is that none of them can turn around and fry you to a crisp, as an annoyed dragon can do. So it's a perilous process, and I intended it to be so.
Well, all right, let's. Okay, so now we are looking at Damon Blackfire?
Damon Blackfire.
Damon Blackfire, Leading the Charge at Redgrass Field by Jose Daniel Cabrera Peña. So this is this character from sort of deeper in the history of the Targaryen dynasty. And he is, I think, if I've got this right, looking at things, he is Dany's great grandfather.
Is he?
Where is he? We'll ask him. He would know just like that.
I don't think so, actually.
No?
Because he's Damon Blackfire, right? That's what you said, Damon
Yeah.
Blackfire at the Redgrass Field?
Yeah.
The Blackfires were a usurping line.
Right.
They were the sons of...
No, I'm sorry, he's not his grand. He's a bastard claimant to the throne.
Yes.
Of Dany's great grandfather. Sorry.
Right. Aegon, King Aegon IV, also known as Aegon the Unworthy, had a lot of bastards. He was a horny guy, and everywhere he went, he fathered children on serving wenches and tavern girls, but also on the daughters and wives of noblemen. And he only had one. Well, he had one son by his legitimate wife, who was also his sister in the Targaryen thing, and that was his legitimate heir. But he didn't actually like that kid very much, and he liked some of his bastards better. And he was not a popular king, Aegon the Unworthy. You could probably guess it from his name. And he made a lot of trouble for Seven Kingdoms because on his deathbed, he legitimized all of his bastards.
Yeah.
And then that created the question of, okay, now they're legitimate, they're not bastards, where do they fall in the line of succession? And one of the oldest bastards, who was a splendid, looked like a Targaryen, great warrior, charismatic, handsome, he gave Blackfire, which is the ancestral sword of Aegon the Conqueror and all the Targaryen kings. And he presented the sword to his son, who was the warrior son. The son who was the crown prince was not much of a warrior. So in some sense, he was giving the sword to the son who was best fit to use it. But that created the issue, well, does the sword represent the kingdom? Was he saying, this son should be my heir? He was unclear on that point. And when you're unclear on that point in the Middle Ages, you normally got a war to clarify the issue. And indeed, that's what happened here. Aegon and his supporters rose up, or Daemon and his supporters rose up after Aegon's death against his half-brother, Daeron. And there was the first of the Blackfire rebellions. And it was followed by 4 more Blackfire rebellions, because Daemon Blackfire fathered children of his own, and there was a whole another line of pretenders, the Blackfire pretenders, that periodically would come invading Westeros and say, no, we're the legitimate kings, and they would try to overthrow the Targaryens. And this was all after the dragons had died out. So in the days when there were dragons, the Targaryens might have been able to deal with this a little more easily. But without dragons, it's all a question of who can raise the biggest armies and who can win the support of the powerful lords and the populace, et cetera.
So just questions of succession are
Yes.
so are just, well, not completely continuous throughout the story, but it comes up again and again. It's obviously very reminiscent of the real historical events that you've talked about being an inspiration, the Wars of the Roses, were similar, not so many bastards, but similar arguments about who is entitled to be the king.
Yeah, I mean, that's, you know, a large part of ancient history and medieval history is devoted to these succession crises. You know, the nation that could actually manage to get its laws and its succession in something approximating smoothness tended to flourish because they didn't have a war of regeneration when a king succeeded his father. But there were always issues that weren't really quite clear, or where they thought, well, this person has a claim, but this person also has a claim, so which claim do you go with? And you see that in English history, too.
All right, now here we have, I think this next one is the landscape. This is, I think, has to be one of my favorite ones.
Ted Naismith's Wall.
Yeah. It's the wall, and it very much reminds me of something that you've said many times, which is that when you had been working in television before you started writing the books, you were so frustrated by how you couldn't get the sort of scale, the grandeur and scale that you wanted, and you knew that in fiction you could just do whatever you wanted, make it as big as you want, and this is really big and really impressive. Can you talk a little bit about, you know, what inspired this particular idea, the idea of the wall?
Well, it was Hadrian's Wall, actually. In 1981, 10 years before I even dreamed of writing these books, I visited England for the first time, and my friend Lisa Tuttle, with whom I'd collaborated on Windhaven, was driving me around England and Scotland and showing me the sights. And we came to Hadrian's Wall, or the bit that remains to it. And it was around this time of year, actually. It was late October. It was fall. It was getting dark and cold in England and Scotland, and we arrived right near sunset as the last of the tour buses were leaving. So we climbed up on the wall and pretty much had it to ourselves, which was really cool because we didn't have a lot of tourists around us. And I stood up there, and the wind was blowing, and the sun was going down, and I looked off and I tried to imagine what it was like to be a Roman legionary from Italy or North Africa or the Near East who'd been sent to this really cold place on the edge of the world, and you know, who knew what the hell was beyond there, and you were like the last outpost of what they thought of as the civilized world. And you know, they had legends and beliefs, and they made very well. I thought there were monsters or demons beyond there, depending on where they came from. And of course, we know that what was actually beyond there were Scotsmen and and Picts. There were Picts back then. But it was a profound feeling, and many years later, when I came to write these books, it came back to me, and I said, I want to do that too. The whole idea of a wall defending civilization against unknown threats beyond, and the people who have to stand on that wall and defend that wall, stirred something profound in me that, and I wanted to evoke that. Of course, in fantasy, you take something real as your root, but you make it bigger and more colorful. So this is a lot bigger than Hadrian's Wall, and it's made of ice, which is kind of cool, and you know, actually needs some magic in it to keep it up and all that. But it's an amazing thing, and of course, in the world of Westeros, it's one of the 8 wonders of the world, or the 7 wonders of the world of Lomas Long. No, actually, that's the 9 wonders made by man, Lomas Longstrider. So, and it would be if it existed in our world too. In fact, you know, I was recently in Scotland for the Edinburgh Book Festival, and they were having they were about to have their vote on independence, whether they should secede from the United Kingdom or not. And I suggested that if they did, they should build a giant ice wall between Scotland and England, and it would be an amazing tourist attraction, and you know, really help the economy of both countries.
You might have some trouble keeping it from melting, though. Okay, this is Winterfell. This is also by Ted Naismith?
Yeah, Ted Naismith.
And this is where the story begins for, you know, for your readers. But now, you know, at the point that we are in the story now, it's been sort of destroyed and Ned is killed, and there's something sort of really sad about looking at a picture of it now, and it made me wonder. I know you're willing to tear down beautiful castles and kill popular characters when you feel like you need to, but do you ever end up missing them once they're gone?
Yeah, I do miss them. Some of them.
The bad ones as well as the good ones?
Well, sometimes, yeah, good villain is hard to replace.
Yeah.
But as I said in the book, all men must die. There is something that appeals to me about runes and I don't know, beauty that has been destroyed or something like that. I was reflecting, you know, I own a movie theater in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where I live, much smaller one than this theater. And I walked in here and said, this is a pretty cool theater, too. I like old theaters, 30s movie palaces and so forth. We had a guy who, New York photographer, actually, his name is Matt Lambros, and he has a website called After the Final Curtain. He came to the Cocteau and did a slideshow for us and an art exhibition of his photographs. He specializes in traveling around the country photographing defunct theaters. Some of them movie palaces and others vaudeville theaters and things like that have been closed, be it for 5 years or 50 years, and they're still there. They're rotting, they're decaying. Some of them are far gone, some of them are almost look like they were just closed yesterday, but there's a strange beauty to all of those. So there is something beautiful about ruins. I mean, when I tour, when I go to Europe, you know, we don't have many castles here in America, but when I go to Europe, I like to visit castles, but my preference is always the ruined castles, where I can clamber over the ruins and try to imagine the way it was, or at least the castles that were fortresses, rather than the ones that may be called a castle, but they're really like a palace from the Jacobean age, and they're full of antique furniture. And now that they're a 4-star hotel, you know, those have their appeals. But give me a good ruin any day.
Okay, and here we have the
Eyrie.
Eyrie, and a site of the infamous Moon Door. It's given many people nightmares.
Yeah, I worked very closely with Ted on all of these.
Yeah.
These was the first art that was done for this book. I wanted accurate versions of these castles. We've had a number of different artists draw them on covers and, you know, on the Fantasy Flight cards and games, and some of them have been beautiful images, but not necessarily accurate to what I described. But I knew with Ted Naismith we were getting one of the great landscape painters of the world, really, and a guy who does really great architectural work. So he and I worked very closely on these and going back and forth on them until we got them pretty much as I see them in my mind's eye.
This one looks like the King Ludwig castle in Bavaria.
Definitely, yeah, definitely inspired by that. But Ludwig didn't think of the sky cells, which is that was my own perverse invention.
Looking at this made me want to ask you if there's one place in all of your books that you would like to live in. Which one would that be?
One place that I would like to live in.
A city or a castle or a...
Well, I mean, there are aspects about a number of them that attract me. You know, I do like cold weather, so I actually probably would like Winterfell. You know, the cold winds, never gets too hot there. That's good. I would like that. Casterly Rock has the advantage of having lots of gold. So you'd be very, very rich living there. The Eyrie has magnificent views. You know, down in Doran, you get great spicy food and great spicy women. So that's good, you know. But ultimately, I think I'd like to stay in Santa Fe, New Mexico, 'cause, we have like modern medicine and the NFL on Sunday. Although after the way the Jets played today, I may give that up.
A very practical answer. Okay. All right. This is the Red Keep at King's Landing. So you already answered one of my questions, which was, you know, how well these match your own vision of the place. No, you don't want to talk about the TV show too much, but which of the locations do you feel the most true to what you imagined?
In the TV show?
Yeah.
Well, there are locations. I mean, we're shooting, you know, in Belfast. We're shooting in. We've shot some in Scotland. But Belfast in Northern Ireland is our main location. We've also shot in Iceland. We're shooting in Spain right now. We've done a lot in Croatia. We've used Morocco and Malta in past years. So there's many, many different actual existing locations that have been used over the years. None of them are exactly what I described in my book, but they sure are gorgeous. I mean, I think we're probably the best looking show on television.
Yeah.
And some of the interior sets are pretty amazing too.
Do you get frustrated ever when it's not quite what you imagined?
I wouldn't say frustrated. I mean, sometimes it's better, you know. I think like their version of the High Hall of the Arrens with the moon door in the floor is probably better than my moon door, which is just a door set in the wall. Because I didn't think of putting it in the floor. That was pretty cool. I like, you know, the show's Iron Throne has become iconic. It's now recognized around the world. And it's numerous people have done parodies. You know, Mad Magazine has had a version made of toilet plungers, and they've shown, you know, sports commissioners have sat on ones made of baseball bats, and there are actual physical versions of the throne. There's like 6 of them in the United States and 3 or 4 of them in Britain, and Spain has one, and you know, these travel around for publicity. So I recognize it's a great looking throne, and it has become iconic, but it's not really my Iron Throne. In this book, you'll see my Iron Throne.
We have one of the slides we have coming up, not the next one, but the one right after that. So let's look at the next one, which is of Dragonstone. This is...
Yeah, Dragonstone has been a bitch. Because it's really a unique castle. I mean, you know, some of this is very easy for me as a writer to describe.
Yeah.
But it's not necessarily easy for the artist to draw.
This was probably, I think, the most over-the-top illustration in the book.
But probably the most accurate to
Really?
what's actually described in the book in all the versions of Dragonstone. I mean, Dragonstone is made by the Valerians, who had dragons and dragonfire and magical means of making stone flow and twist, and they could make it into any form that they wanted to, and then it would harden in that form. So they built these massive structures of not of bricks or of stones mortared together, but of solid stone, shaped by intense fires and magic. And in the case of Dragonstone, like the towers look like great stone dragons, and you know, the entrances look like the heads of dragons. And you know, I allude to this in the book, but it's difficult for an artist to capture. So a lot of the versions that we've had of Dragonstone over the years have been not not really great, and this is one of the best here.
This is by Philip Straub, by the way.
And is the Iron Throne the next one?
Yes.
I'll get back to that yet.
This is the correct version of the Iron Throne.
Yeah, I mean, I state repeatedly in the book that the Iron Stone is huge. Huge. It towers over the room like a great beast, and it's ugly. It's asymmetric. It was put together by blacksmiths, not by craftsmen and experts in furniture manufacture. And you have to walk up iron steps, and when a king sits on it, he's like 10 feet above everybody else in the hall, so he's in this raised position looking down on them. And the hall itself is huge.
And the throne is made of the swords of the defeated enemies.
Yeah, the throne is made of all the swords. You know, during Aegon's conquest, when people surrendered to them, they set down their sword as a series of submission. And of course, when he won a battle by burning everybody, there were all these burned, melted swords lying around. So he gathered all of them up and he gave them and said, "Make a throne out of this." And that's what they did. And it's a sign of dominance and conquest. And when you stand before it, you're supposed to remember that, you know. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Was a little bit of the psychology of that, but nobody ever got it right. I mean, there were comic book versions, and there were versions in the card game and the board game, and there were versions on the cover, and there were versions that were done for conventions. You know, the very first, there was a wooden one that I sat on in 1996 at the ABA that looked like the embossed version on the first edition, the Silver Book, but none of them were ever really right. The closest one who ever came was Marc Simonetti, the French artist. And even his first one wasn't right, but since he was the closest, I worked with him, and then we got him for this book, and he and I went back a half dozen times to finally get something I could say, yeah, this is absolutely right. Now, of course, you can't do this in a TV show. It's not something I criticize HBO for or something like that. I mean, the thrones they have are enormously large and cumbersome to move and expensive to build. To build this monstrosity would blow the budget of an entire episode, and it wouldn't fit in the set. I mean, our throne room is in the Paint Hall in Belfast in Northern Ireland. Now, the Paint Hall is the largest soundstage in Europe. It was originally part of the old Harland and Wolff shipyard where they built the Titanic, and they painted the ships, the hulls of the ships in this hall, which gives you an idea of the scale of it. And we've divided it into a number of pods, and our throne room is in one of them. And it's a very large set, but it's not large enough. You would need St. Paul's Cathedral. If they would give us St. Paul's Cathedral or Westminster Abbey to shoot in, and a year to build a giant throne like that that would dominate the entire thing and go halfway to the ceiling, then you could get the Iron Throne the way it's described in the books. But this is the difference between books and television. You know, I can say, well, that the wall is 700 feet high, but I don't actually have to build a 700-foot high wall or a giant throne made of nasty-looking swords here. It's interesting. There's actually a terrific speech that Littlefinger gives in last season, where he talks about the Iron Throne made from 1,000 thrones of Aegon's enemies, and then he said, I counted them once, and really there's only 137, and you know, it's when truth and legend disagree, print a legend, and it's an interesting speech that's true in the show, but it's not true in the books because there really are thousands of swords in the real Iron Throne, the gigantic Iron Throne that sits in King's Landing in the books.
It reminds me a little bit of Tamerlane was supposedly made a huge pile of his defeated enemies' skulls as a monument to his greatness, and that's what this has always reminded me of. It's great to see it.
Yeah, that was a tradition among many conquerors, the Pyramid of Skulls.
Yeah.
It's, you know, one of those things you can always go back to. The old traditions are good.
This is probably more structurally stable. Okay. All right, now this is a trial by combat, if I am correct, between Sir Duncan the Tall of the Kingsguard and Lord Lionel Baratheon. And this is the character in white. Sir Duncan is the character.
Is the Dunk of Duncan Egg?
Duncan
yes.
Egg. And this
But I
is-
haven't really told this story
Yeah.
yet, so
it's kind of a
you know,
spoiler
we'll
there.
we'll get to it eventually, in like the seventh or eighth Duncan Egg story.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. But he joins the Kingsguard. Newsflash.
well, we kind of knew that.
Yeah,
That's
okay,
that's
all right, well,
that's
okay.
referenced in the books.
He's fighting Lionel Baratheon.
Right,
That's the newsflash.
right.
In his capacity as the leader of the Kingsguard, is he?
Well, not initially, but eventually.
All right, all right. Is there anything more you want to tell us about that?
No.
Okay.
Actually, this was one of the hardest things about putting this book together, was the question of how much to tell and how much not to tell. Because the readers, of course, want to know everything. And I knew some things, and you know, I'd shared some of them with my editor, Ann Grohl, and some of them with Elio and Linda. But there are things that I wanted to reveal in later books, in later novels, or like in the case of that, in later Duncan Egg stories. So it was like, you know, I suggested at one point, like when we were dealing with one of the big mysteries that people want to know a lot about was Summerhall. And I don't.
Summerhall, should we explain what Summerhall is? Does everyone know what it is?
Summerhall was a
All do.
Targaryen secondary castle that was in the sort of the border where the Stormlands and the Reach and the Dornish Marches all come together. And it was home castle to Egg's father in the Duncan Egg stories, and to some other Targaryen princes during a certain period of time. But it was destroyed at a certain point, and there have been references to the book. Something happened at Summerhall, something dark and traumatic. And what exactly happened? And the readers all want to know this. And I know what happened, but I don't want to tell the readers yet, because I want to reveal that in a later Duncan Egg story. But how do we get around that? Because the Maester is writing the history, and this is a very important event. So I suggested that since we're doing this as a mock facsimile, that perhaps Maester Yandale could write a detailed account and then accidentally knock over his inkwell, and there would be a big blotch on that page when you got to that book. That was my answer here. Anne actually talked me out of that because she felt that if we did that, a lot of customers would be returning to the bookstore and say, "Oh, I got a defective copy. There's a big blotch here on page 314. Could you give me a copy that has that in?" You're not going to actually find out much about Summerhall in this book. Sorry to tell you. We didn't do the blotch, but we got around it in another manner. But that was unfortunately my reaction to a lot of this stuff. At point out, well, wait a minute, I don't want to reveal that. I'm going to use that in a later Duncan. No, you can't tell them that. That's a good detail. No, leave that out. And finally, Elio and Linda and Anne ganged up on it and said, "You have to tell them some of these things." So I did, and actually I made up, you know, there's amazing amount of new material in this book, and stories that I made up just for the book, and stories that I eventually was going to include in the novel, and they'll still be in the novels and the Duncan Egg stories, but if you read this, you'll already know somewhat of what has happened. So there's lots of new stuff in here, but I still have mixed feelings about telling things like that duel with Sir Baratheon and the Laughing Storm, but I'll get to eventually.
We've got a couple of more images, but I need to get to the questions, so let's just go through them quickly. This is the Ironborn Longship at Sea by Tomasz, do you know, Jedrzejczyk? I'm sorry.
Tomasz Jedrzejczyk, yes, he's Eastern European.
This is incredible.
I had a lot of fun with the histories of the Ironborn. They're a bunch of colorful bastards.
Yeah, they've got a very mysterious past that I found one of the more intriguing parts of this. And then here's Aegon again, that handsome devil. And I think we'll go back to, this is by Magalia Villanueva. And we'll go back to the cover and get to some of these questions.
Magali is, by the way, doing the next year's Ice and Fire calendar. So she's pretty amazing. She's a French artist. She does amazing portraits in particular.
Go back to her Aegon again.
Yeah.
It doesn't go backwards. All right. Well, we don't want to run through it all the way.
We've been very proud of the calendars that we've done. We had Michael Comark, Ted Naismith, John Piccaccio, let me see, Gary Gianni, and this year Donato Giancola have all done past calendars. I love fantasy art. I love illustrated books. And a chance to do these calendars, these art calendars, is you know, one that I really appreciate. We're trying to make it a rival to the long-running Tolkien calendar and get just some of the amazing best fantasy artists in the world to do it. So Magali is the first woman to do it, so we wanted to you know, vary that a bit and have her bring a different perspective. Second French person, but the first woman. So she's going to do some spectacular work, so keep an eye out for that next year. But meanwhile, the 2015 calendar by Donato is out and on sale, and that one is amazingly gorgeous too.
Okay, well these are some fantastic questions, both from this crowd and from Tumblr. So I'm going to go for some of the more manageable ones. First, from Jeff22003 via Tumblr. Who are your influences for Stannis Baratheon? Is he based on anyone from history, literature, or politics?
To some extent, he is inspired by Tiberius Caesar. Not necessarily, partly to Tiberius Caesar from history, but to a great extent by Tiberius Caesar as portrayed by, God, I'm blanking on the actor's name, Baker, I believe, in I, Claudius, the incredible British TV series I, Claudius. George Baker, I believe it was, yes, played Tiberius in that, and there's significant differences too, but that series, if you haven't seen I, Claudius, it's one of the great historical television series of all time. Incredible acting by Sean Phillips as Livia, and of course Derek Jacobi as Claudius himself, and John Hurt is in it as Caligula, Brian Blessed as Augustus. All of them got an enormous amount of acclaim for their portrayals, and deservedly so. The writing was also amazing, based on the Robert Graves book, but you know, the scripting was terrific. George Baker, though, was a very important character in the first 6 or so episodes, and he doesn't seem to get the acclaim that the other people got, and I think he really should. His Tiberius was terrific. So that was at least one inspiration, but they're not at all the same character, but they do share certain characteristics.
In terms of world building, how do you separate culture and ethnicity from religion in your writing, and how do you reconcile them? That's a big one. There's a couple of questions about the religion of Westeros in this stack, so it may be that you'll.
Well, you know, that's the kind of abstract question I find it difficult to answer. I mean, I don't know how other people write, but I don't ever sit down and saying, how am I going to separate ethnicity from religion here in this thing? It's like I'm more, okay, we just went over a mountain range. Who lives here? What should their religion be? Who can I steal from in history to model them on that I haven't already used, you know, and that sort of thing. So it's a different process entirely. But I do always try to consider the question of religion, which I think is important because religion shapes societies and shapes cultures and shapes values. And even in our modern world, of course, we see conflicts all around the world being driven by religious disputes, even now. And of course, through history, the religious disputes are legion, and the millions of people who have died in the names of that are, it's appalling to think about. I was raised Catholic, but have long since stopped practicing. I suppose I'd be considered a skeptic now, and I just look at religions. Say, really, are you really going to kill all these people because a giant invisible guy in the sky told you to? And your giant invisible guy in the sky is different. But you can't ignore religion in fantasy, I think, because it's too important in history. And the other thing that, of course, is worth mentioning about religion is in fantasy, is that in most fantasies, you have working magic. You have magic that demonstrably works, which would affect the religious feelings of many people, you know? Even when I was a Catholic and going to catechism and I was being taught all these Catholic things, you know, I would sort of say, sister, why is it that all this walking on water and raising the dead and stuff took place like 2,000 years ago? Because if it took place now, I would be much more convinced if I could see it on television, you know. And indeed, if I would become the most religious guy in the world if we could actually see someone raising the dead or, you know, ascending to heaven or you know, doing any of these things we read about in the Bible and other ancient religious texts. And in fantasy, that does happen here, where we are seeing in the Red God, you know, for example, in my own books, people say, well, why are the Brotherhood Without Banners abandoning their own religion that they were raised with, the Seven, to follow Thoros of Myr and the Red God? Well, it's partly because they've seen him raise the dead. Not once, but several times. Yeah. That's persuasive. Yeah. So they're thinking, well, maybe this guy has the right of it here.
Yeah. Because Westeros is sort of based on a medieval European world, it's actually kind of striking how one of the differences is that the medieval European world was so much more saturated with religion than I think Westeros is.
Well, religion's pretty much there in Westeros. It's, you know...
I guess they don't exactly have a pope.
Well, the Faith of the Seven does have a pope. It's the High Septon. But, of course, we're seeing in the course of the books what's happened when, you know, the High Septons who are in when the story begins are the kind of corrupt High Septons who like to sit around their palaces and eat chocolates and diddle little boys, you know. But in the process of that, they have been replaced by the character I call the High Sparrow, who is a reforming zealot who has a very different and more fundamentalist attitude towards some of these beliefs. And some people, like Cersei, are discovering, you know, to her dismay, that he can't be treated the same way as the previous corrupt ones. So I'm certainly trying to deal with religion. And there's also a lot of material in the World of Ice and Fire, and will be even more in the Grimmarillion, about what happened to the faith when the Targaryens took over, and the conflicts between them, and the war between Aegon's sons and the Faith Militant, and all of that stuff, which leads up to why things are the way they are in the present day.
Yeah. I really liked that part in particular of the book. Okay, this is kind of long, but okay, you wrote the foreword to Maurice Druon's A Cursed King series and consider yourself a fan. Do you feel you drew any inspiration from Robert of Artois for the character of Gregor Clegane? Sorry, The Mountain That Rides. Again, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
I was like, why am I?
The Accursed King series was certainly an influence on Game of Thrones. If you haven't read it, it's a terrific series of historical novels written by a French writer named Maurice Druon. And it's not fantasy, it's strictly historical. It relates basically the fall of the Capetian dynasty and the beginnings of the 100 Years' War. But it's got some stuff in it that's almost fantasy-like, the Curse of the Templars and the downfall of Philip the Fair and all three of his sons. And it's got poisonings and impersonations and battles and, adulterous affairs and all kinds of great stuff, all straight from history, which is cool. And part of one of the secondary subplots does revolve around this fight between two lords, cousins actually, for this particular province, and Robert Artois is one of them. And he is a big, blustering guy. I wouldn't say he was an influence on The Mountain That Rides, though, aside from being big. As I recall, he's described as quite large, but he's more like Robert Baratheon in some sense. He's a big, blustering, kind of hard-drinking, hard-living sort of man. The Mountain is a kind of quietly homicidal sociopath. Yeah. So they're very different.
Okay. When do you create the maps? Before, during, or after you write the story?
The map creation is ongoing. When I began back in 1991, I'd probably written like 50 pages, and I said, oh, I better create a map so I know where I am. Maps are necessary to fantasy, I think. I know some critics occasionally have sort of mocked them, but if you're creating a secondary world, you really need them because, if I'm writing straight historical fiction and my character in Ireland says, I must go to France, you don't need a map. We kind of know where France is. But in my world, if a character from Winterfell says, I must go to Dorne, you don't know if Dorne is the next village or, or halfway around the world. So you better have a map so these things that the characters are saying make some sense. So I created a map, and it was, basically pretty simple. But as the story continued, I started adding more and more places to it, and it's ongoing. And then, of course, a couple of years ago, we did the map book, Lands of Ice and Fire, which involved considerably more map creation because they wanted maps of places, like initially it was said like, okay, George, we want to do this map book here. Can we, we'll just take the maps that are in the books and we'll blow them up and they'll be beautiful poster size. Oh, that's great. That won't take any work from me at all. And then when you blew them up to poster sizes, though, you get the call, hey, when we take these maps from the front of the book and we blow them up to poster size, it's a lot of blank space. Could you kind of like invent some rivers and hills and towns and stuff to put there? So I wound up detailing that. And that was especially cute when you got over to Essos, because, my map of the Dothraki Sea, when the time we did the map book, there was a sheet of white paper, and there was a dot in it, and it said, Vise Dothrak, and a little mountain drawn next to it, Mother of Mountains, and then Dothraki Sea written over the entire blanket. page. So I think I need to, put a lot more in this one too. So there's a lot of making there.
I would guess the answers to that are during and after.
That's right. And more tomorrow, I'm sure.
Okay. This is sort of metaphysical. Is there any connection between the Lord of Light and the White Walkers in terms of God and the devil?
No.
The birth of a dragon seems to be connected to fire and death. Does birthing a dragon require a human sacrifice?
Interesting notion. I mean, there are clues in the books, so, I think I'm going to dodge that one right now. The Lord of Light, by the way, Melisandre's religion, which was referenced in the previous thing. Again, I don't try to do direct things from history, but I'm certainly inspired by a lot of real history. And the religion of the Lord of Light is based in part on a couple of the dualist religions that actually existed in our world. One of them, the I can never say that.
Zoroastrian.
Yeah, whatever that is, yes. And the other one, the Cathars, or the Albigensians, who were destroyed. They were a Christian heresy that flourished in southern France, and a crusade was launched against them, and they were ultimately all wiped out in what is sometimes called Europe's first genocide. The famous statement, "Kill them all, God will sort them out," actually dates back to the Albigensian crusade when the Christian Crusaders captured an Albigensian city, but only half of the people in it were Albigensians, the rest were good Catholics. And one of the people said, well, how do they look just like us, how do we know who to kill? And the commander said, kill them all, God will know his own. And that's straight out of real history. But the Cathars were a very strange heresy that make fascinating reading, because they were true dualists. I mean, Christianity has this concept of God and the devil, but the devil is definitely, second place. He's not the equal to God. He's a loser. And God permits him to do little things, but in the end, there's no doubt who's gonna come out. The Albigensians, it was a real dualist system where they thought there's a dark God and there's a God of light. There's a God of good and a God of evil, and they're at perpetual war, and they're equal, and we don't know who's going to win. But the interesting part of it, they were a Christian heresy, and their belief was that Jesus was actually the son of the God of light, and so therefore he didn't really have a real body. That here they were kind of straying from Orthodox Catholic teaching, because the body that we all live in is a creation of the God of evil, and indeed the world that we live in is a creation of the God of evil. And it was a fairly persuasive argument, especially in the early Middle Ages, because they looked around and they said, look at this world that you live in, where people, there's no justice, there's no peace. People come by and kill you and rape your women and burn your crops, and the Lords can cut off your head at any times, and you're going to get all these horrible diseases, and you're going to sicken and die, and going to be, in great pain, and women bring forth children in pain. What kind of good God would design this world? Obviously, this world has been created by the evil God, and the good God is trying to get us out of it. And that was, the Catholics refuted this argument by killing them all. So that makes fascinating reading, but that's the seed from which the Melisandre's Lord of Light comes, that and Zoroaster, which was similar, but I can't pronounce, so I won't talk about it.
What is your editing process? Do you always work with the same editor? I know that you do. It's Ann Rule, right?
Yeah, Ann Grohl, who I believe is here, has been my editor on this almost since the beginning. It was actually purchased by Bantam by another editor, and Ann was at a different house that tried to purchase it but lost. But then the other editor left, and Ann came over to the house and wound up being my editor at the place, and she's been with me since the beginning. And then over in the UK, I have Jane Johnson of HarperCollins has been my editor since the beginning, and they've both been great. It's been terrific to work with them.
This person wants to know, how much input does she have?
I don't know, 17%. I send her stuff, and she makes comments, and she gives me notes, and I revise some things, and I don't revise some things, and sometimes we have discussions or arguments about it, and yeah, and I get separate notes from Jane too, from England. So they're the two editors who weigh in when I deliver a manuscript. And also Elio and Linda, I usually send them a copy too, but they catch different things. But oh, this guy's eyes were a different color in book 3. Or you have a horse here that's changed sex, so that one got through. They didn't catch that one, but I have a transsexual
They're
horse.
only human.
But,
Okay, this is one I didn't anticipate. Do your books have any references to the Grateful Dead? You call your home Terrapin Station, and the song Dire Wolf and Cassidy and Dark Star have names and references in the books. There's a portion of the audience that really cares about this question.
well, I'm certainly a fan of the Grateful Dead. I've attended Grateful Dead concerts, and my wife Paris is perhaps even more of a fan of the Grateful Dead. And there are a lot of Grateful Dead references in my my famous rock and roll novel, The Armageddon Rag. In fact, at one point we were hoping to make a movie of that and film the Nazgul concert scenes at Grateful Dead concerts. But of course that came to nothing, sad to say. And I do have Grateful Dead lyrics always coming around and rattling around in my head. Ripple is one of my favorite songs of all time. There is a road, no simple highway. But actually in this book, I don't know.
Or any of the Ice and Fire books? It sounds like these are...
Maybe. I'd have to think about that.
Not intentionally.
Not that I can remember.
How did you decide on the name Hodor?
That's not his real name. That's just what they call him. His real name is Walder. If you were named Walder, you might want to be called Hodor too. I don't know. You have to keep reading.
Okay. Ooh, that question is... this particular book reminds this question asker of some illustrated Bibles I read as a kid. Were they an inspiration for the design of the World of Ice and Fire?
No. We had an illustrated Bible, as I recall. So I've seen illustrated Bibles, but I actually grew up with illustrated books. I love illustrated books. I had, as a kid, I had Treasure Island and King Arthur and his Knights, with those amazing N.C. Wyeth illustrations, which I fell in love with. And kids' books, some of the things I had always had some artwork in them too, and of course I love comic books. I think it's a shame that most contemporary books are not illustrated, that we've fallen out of that. And since I've become popular enough to sort of get my druthers on some of these, I've taken steps to have many of my books illustrated in limited editions. A number of these books have been done by Subterranean Press in beautifully illustrated editions with tons of black and white interiors and gorgeous covers and so forth. And we have the Dunk and Egg stories, actually. After this book, my next book will be next spring, and it'll be called The Night of the Seven Kingdoms. And it is a collection of the 3 published Dunk and Egg novellas, The Hedge Knight, The Sworn Sword, and The Mystery Knight, but illustrated by Gary Gianni. And Gary did the Ice and Fire calendar a couple years ago. He's done Prince Valiant for years. He did the Wandering Star books for Bran McMorn and Solomon Kane. Gorgeous books. If you don't have those and you're a Robert E. Howard fan, some of the most beautiful books I've ever seen. And, you know, Gianni looks like N.C. Wyeth returned from the dead in some of his work. He's just an amazing artist. So we wanted him to illustrate the Dunk and Egg collection, and you know, our thought was, well, do a couple color pieces and then like 7 or 8 interior illustrations that you can do. And he read them and fell in love with them and got back and said, well, I'll do it, but I don't want to do that. What I want to do is like a picture for every page. Wow. And just have this thing absolutely loaded with gorgeous art. And so that's what he's been working on for the last year and a half or so. So when that comes out, that's going to be an amazing illustrated book, The Night of the Seven Kingdoms. Be sure to get the hardcover of that one. It'll be well worth it.
What would the sigil and words of House Martin be?
Oh boy, I don't know. I once designed a shield for myself when in the early ages of working on this series. What the hell did I put on it? I think I put references to some of my previous books on it. What would the words be? Maybe deadline? What deadline?
Is there anything you wrote in the earlier books that you feel backed you into a narrative corner?
There's certainly, and that's overstating it. I mean, there's certainly mistakes in the earlier books that, you know, there's that transsexual horse I mentioned, and there are some eyes that change color. These are simple mistakes, but they irritate me because I don't want to make any mistakes, and also because there are in the books deliberate inconsistencies where I'm using the device of the unreliable narrator or using a point of view structure that I do where 2 people remember something that happened in very different ways and may not be remembering it accurately. And because there are these other mistakes, some of my readers tend to assume that those things are also mistakes when they're not. You know, they're me being very clever. So that's irritating. There are, again, these are all relatively minor things. I wouldn't say they back me into a corner. Well, the introduction of Tyrion, where he does like a somersault off a door frame and lands on his feet the first time he meets Jon Snow, was probably something I could have left out. I've kind of explained it later and done a pretty good job of it, I think, but it still might have been better just omitted. Also, in that same chapter where they're having a feast at Winterfell and the king's party is there and all that, it's from Jon's viewpoint, I believe, is the viewpoint character in that scene. And Bran is not mentioned when everybody goes marching forth and so forth. And numerous fans have written me letters about, you know, the deep meaning of why Bran is omitted, and it's just, I sort of forgot about Bran when I was writing that chapter. He was there, I just happened to Jon wasn't glancing in his direction and didn't mention him that thing. So that's the kind of stuff that, you know, gets by you, but I don't think it's backing you into the corner. It's, oh, yeah, I made a little misstep there, I stubbed my toe.
Okay, well, we need to wind down now, but I just want to, I have a question that I was asked to ask you by a friend. There's a rumor that when you met with David Benioff and Dan Weiss to talk, who are the showrunners of the HBO show, to talk about adapting the books, there was one question that you asked them.
Yes, that's true. That's not a rumor. That's true.
Okay.
I asked them an important question because I wanted to determine how carefully they had read the books.
And that question is, who is Jon Snow's mother?
That was the question. Yes.
So you
And I
think
will
about
say no more about it.
that. Okay.
But yeah, you know, we had a great meeting at the Palm Restaurant in Los Angeles. We met for hours and discussed the books for hours, and you know, it was great. But in Hollywood, and this is the first time I'd met either David and Dan. I was you know, when the meeting was set up, I looked them up, and of course I was already familiar with some of David's works, not quite so much with Dan, but I knew their credits, and it certainly seemed to be a great meeting. But you know, in Hollywood, there's a lot of bullshit artists out there, so you know, you have to be careful. So I wanted to, you know, they said they'd read the books and they loved them, and I thought I'd see how carefully they had read the books, and they passed with flying colors.
Yeah,
So
I
it was
have
great.
All right. Well, thank you to George. Thank you for coming.
Thank you all.